This panel is about a really important area, which is how we use evidence to improve the impact of disadvantaged pupils. We've got a wonderful panel here. I'm going to introduce them individually, and then I think you're going to speak for a couple of minutes each. So Dr. Rebecca Allen, who is Director now of the Education Data Lab, of course an academic at Institute of Education. I think Education Data Lab is a really interesting new academic model. It's already paid dividends for us, in which turning around robust data very quickly for policy influence, and that's really what Becky's all about. So anyway, I'll hand over to you first.
Thank you. So I've contributed a chapter to the booklet that you have today, to the report that you have today, on why it's so difficult to know whether, what, where and why the pupil premium gap is closing. And I'll just highlight 3 points that I think some people will find controversial, but not all. So the first thing to say is I talk about why it's very hard for us to decide whether pupil premium gaps are closing, either nationally or within individual schools. In the report, I write about the 5A to C measure. The gap is not really closing on that measure, but in any case, this is a really dreadful measure for us to monitor pupil performance. It's a threshold measure, and in most schools, their performance on this measure hangs on just 2 teachers. These are the teachers who teach the CD borderline classes in English and maths. And I will be delighted when this measure finally disappears in 2016. So we also talk about the attainment gap using a new metric, Attainment 8. And this has nice properties. It judges the attainment of all children in the school, regardless of their starting points. The gap is closing very, very fast nationally on this measure. But we have to be careful about how we interpret this. Part of the reason it's closing so fast is simply that subject entry mixes are changing, and that over the past few years, it's been the pupil premium children who've experienced the greatest change in the types of subjects that they've been entered for. Particularly, they're gradually moving towards a more EBAC-aligned curriculum. And that's why this is closing so fast. So as we monitor this in the future, it's really important we always disaggregate this as a metric and say how much of the closing of the gap is due to subject mix changes and how much is due to average point score changes. Whenever we have these broad measures of overall attainment, and it's really hard to monitor what's happening over time on them, not least that the government keeps changing the ways that we want to measure them, it's nice to look at individual subjects, such as maths and English, but there's a warning there too, because we're about to move to a new point score in these subjects, the 0 to 9, and a rescaling of the old grades across all our existing subjects that move to the 0 to 9 measure later. And on that metric, because of these changes, we're likely to see the gap increasing, unfortunately. So a couple of other quick points. In this report, I urge schools to look at the attainment of pupil premium children, not to monitor their pupil premium gaps. School gaps depend on the social profile of your non-free school meal children. This is a very diverse bunch of children. High free school meal schools tend to have tiny pupil premium gaps or even reverse pupil premium gaps because their non-FSM children are equally deprived. So whilst gaps are important nationally, these are the things that drive our social class immobility. For individual children, what's important is just that you get good qualifications to get on in life, and the comparison shouldn't matter. And the final thing I want to say that may be controversial, and it relates to the difficulties, I think, of the audit trail and the requirement that places on schools, is that it is okay to spend pupil premium money on non-pupil premium children. I think that head teachers and teachers employ their own moral and ethical compass when they decide how to spend pupil premium money, as they should. There are many non-eligible children who are equally deserving of interventions, either because they're eligible but they're not claiming, but more importantly, because their families are in work. But despite that, they're living in significant poverty, and we should not deny these children the type of interventions that they could equally benefit from. But also because our pupil premium children are simply not segregated in classrooms away from other children. And if we want to spend money on the things that we know raise standards, many of these are things that will affect all children in the school, such as giving pay rises to your outstanding teachers to make sure they don't leave your school, investing in continual professional development. So it's tricky with an audit trail to justify these things, but I would say just fiddle your audit trail and go ahead and use your own moral compass to make these decisions.
Thank you very much, Becky. So I'm going to jump over to Steve Higgins now, who is Professor of Education at University of Durham. I embarrass Steve all the time by discussing our relationship as a love affair, because and Rob Coe's here as well. So actually, it's a bit of a love triangle here. We together created the first pupil premium toolkit, which is now the brilliant teaching and learning toolkit that, of course, the EF now hosts and develops. So anyway, it's great. And I was very much the brawn. He was very much. These two were very much the brains in that process. Steve he's probably read more academic papers on education than anyone, including John Hattie, actually, I would say. So he's absolutely brilliant in many ways. But Steve, do you want to go next?
Yeah, as you know, Lee, I worry about lots of things in evidence, and one of the things that working with Lee and then the Education Endowment Foundation has encouraged me to do is to be a bit more decisive and clear in the way that we communicate research findings. I'd just like to reflect on where we've got to, which is the piece that Lee and I wrote for the booklet today. Research clearly has to be accurate, accessible, and actionable. And they're really the themes, I think, in reflecting on where we've got to with the toolkit that are probably helpful. At the beginning, I was obsessed with accuracy, so I'd sit neatly on the fence, trying not to commit myself about what the implications were for any particular study, but wanting to hedge it with caveats. And Lee and then the EF team have very much convinced us that yes, you can be accurate, but you need to communicate research and information in a way that's accessible. And I think given the National Audit Office reporting that, 64% of leaders now at least say they consult the toolkit, has been a real testimony to its accessibility. But in that report, there was also a bit of a sting in the tail, which is my last A on actionable. How do we ensure that research evidence is in a form that's useful for schools to do something with it to bring about improvement for disadvantaged pupils? And that's really where I think we are as a team in thinking about this at the moment. I think there are some real challenges here. One is, if you like, that the toolkit gives general messages. It averages things, so it gives you an idea of a best bet, on average, what's likely to be useful. What we need is more help with diagnosis to identify which are likely to be the best solutions, because that will help us in using research evidence more effectively. And then one of the other huge challenges that's hidden by the research is we know an awful lot about short-term impact. We don't know a lot about the long-term and cumulative impact of different interventions. My metaphor there is it's a bit like squeezing a balloon. You can increase performance or achievement in pretty much any area you choose, and you get a nice bulge that you can measure. But what we're interested in is how you get more educational air in that balloon, if you like. How do we ensure the compound interest of starting early with successful interventions that are then built on successively through a disadvantaged young person's educational career to make sure they beat the indicators that would apparently condemn them to lack of success? So that's a real challenge. And the final one came up from something someone said this morning about kind of the fragmented nature of the evidence. We know a bit about how to improve specific things, but does that mean we're going to create successful, educated individuals as the result of that process? So how do we bring all that together to make sure that the children we're supporting do actually end up succeeding? So yes, I think we've come a long way. I've been astonished at the success of the toolkit. What academic wouldn't want 64% of schools reading your work? But there's an awful long way to go.
Thank you, Steve. And over to Tim Loynig, of course, you all know, Chief Scientific Advisor and Chief Analyst at the Department of Education, as well as being obviously an academic at LSE. You were, of course, David Law's advisor at one point, and unusually for an advisor, they've actually offered you a now permanent position at the department, which is quite unusual. But you're a rare breed in that you can navigate both data sets and the corridors of Whitehall, which is very, very unusual. But anyway,
so it's not that both my colleagues Tom Schenner and Sam Friedman were also advisors at one point and now permanent. So I think it's less uncommon than it has been. So I should say, as an academic, I'd be very surprised if 64% of schools ever used my academic work. Though if you are interested in the height of Danish and Norwegian sailors captured by the British Navy in the Napoleonic Wars, please see me afterwards and I will send you my current work in progress. I hadn't expected you to laugh quite so enthusiastically.
The anniversary of Napoleon, so it maybe get more interesting.
Yes, that was only coincidence. I'm a proper academic. I hadn't noticed it was the anniversary until I was halfway through my work. So I do live in an ivory tower half the week. I'm even on the 7th floor now. So I think your point about diagnosis is absolutely critical. To paraphrase Tolstoy, all happy children are the same, but all struggling children are different. Unless you know why that child is struggling, you're really unlikely to come up with a successful intervention. And that's something that no toolkit, no government is ever going to be successful about. That's where teachers in classrooms, heads, people with good data management are going to be successful, and where the front line is absolutely critical, and where experience is really and absolutely important. I guess in terms of evidence, there are two questions that I always have in the back of my mind. The first is, what teacher at this exact moment in time is doing something differently because of the toolkit, because of the pupil premium, because of the sorts of information that both the government and people like Becky are putting out? I fear that if we rang up a whole bunch of teachers now and literally we parachute into their classroom and said, stop, what have you done in the last quarter of an hour that's different? The answer wouldn't be as rosy as we would like it to be. And part of the challenge for the next 5 years is getting the toolkit not just embedded as something that people are aware of or have read, but is embedded day by day, so that teachers, much more like doctors, are aware that part of their job is to keep up to date with the evidence and then put it into practice. And the second question I ask is not just what's different for teachers here and now, but what's different for senior management? What is going to be different, Russell and Brian, what are your members doing differently this September to last September because of new information that's come to light? Because they've heard John speak on it, because they've read the toolkit, whatever it is. Will there be, for example, less streaming in schools? I pick streaming not because I think it's the single most critical thing, it clearly isn't from the toolkit, but it's an SLT decision above all. It's generally thought to be harmful, on average, subject to all the caveats you said. Will we see less streaming in future? Will there be less streaming this September than last September? I don't know the answer to that. It's an empirical question that we could find out. But if we really want to know that the toolkit is effective, we need people to be going around and testing things like that to see whether people are taking notice when they are actually the agents who make the decision, rather than just saying, oh, our feedback is better, because the toolkit says feedback is really important, and therefore we know to keep Ofsted happy, we need to be really clear that our feedback is very good. We haven't actually proven our feedback is any good and our marks aren't getting any better, but we're going to, we want demonstrable evidence. And then we want demonstrable evidence that it has worked, because the evidence so far is clear in many cases, but that doesn't mean when you roll it out, it will always be the same. And here the best book I know is Evidence-Based Policy, A Practical Guide to Doing It Better by Cartwright and Hardy, which says that when you first do something, it often works really well. People are enthusiastic. The people who try it first of all like it. But when you roll it out nationwide, the quality of training goes down, people feel they're forced to do it, they don't have the same sense of agency and pride, and actually it all crumbles to dust. And I think that is a really important thing. Teaching is much harder than medicine. Ultimately, antibiotics work. They work irrespective of whether the patient believes they work irrespective of whether the doctor believes they work. So long as you give the patient antibiotics and they've got a bacterial infection, by and large they get better. That's not true with teaching. If things like metacognition work, they work because both sides understand how they work, and it depends how you deliver them. And that's why social science is much more interesting and much harder than being a doctor. But this I will say, one area we need to go further, and doctors have got it right. The most prestigious doctors are the doctors who take on the hard cases. Yesterday I travelled from Waterloo to Surbiton on the train with a man with a Brompton bike like mine, and thus we got talking. And he was an intensive care paediatrician. Whoa, this is a guy who sees children die in front of him, I'm guessing, though I didn't ask this explicitly, week in, week out. But he was very proud of being an intensive care doctor. He knows that is top of the tree. And that's true in medicine. GPs don't have the same respect as working in a world-famous hospital on the hard cases. I don't sense we're there with teaching. I don't sense that teachers say with great pride, I work in the toughest school in Britain. I am in. I mean, we're not going to start calling them intensive care schools. That would be wrong. Don't get me wrong. Do not misquote me on saying that. But I want a sense where people are really proud of doing the hardest but ultimately the most important and most rewarding job there is, which is turning around the lives of children whose lives would otherwise be way less than they are capable of being. And until people are as proud as that doctor was on the train, we haven't got where we need to get to.
Right, last but not least, John Thomsett on my left here, who I'm sure many of you will know, head teacher at Huntington School, where you've been a teacher for 26 years and a head for 11. I know that because you all know the famous education blog now. I can't remember how many readers it will be, but there are lots of them. And John is a real example, I think, of a head teacher who's really embraced evidence and research and did a tour with me of the school very recently, and it really comes across, actually, how much evidence. And I recommend you get this book, which is just published. There's a quote on the back. It happens to be from me, but it's part autobiography, part practical guide. You will not find a more heartfelt and honest account of what really matters for teaching and learning. It is true. John?
What introduction. Last Tuesday at about 8 o'clock in the evening on Amazon, in the teaching section, Kindle only, I was #1 bestseller. There you go. Probably sold about 3, I think.
That's more than any of my books have ever done.
Come on. Gosh, I've got so much I could talk about. And following Tim's really hard. What an amazing whistle kind of a tour that was. And sitting next to Becky. Becky's article in here is just great. And if you haven't read it, please read it, because it brings up 2 things for me. First of all, I just say the context. In 2018, our school, it's an 11 to 18 comprehensive school, one of Alistair Campbell's bog standard comprehensive schools, I'd imagine, 1,500 students. In 2018, in real terms, we will spend £770,000 less than we will spend in 2010. Right, that's the context of where we are. And if you look on the RM finance package that we still use, the pupil premium money comes under the banner Standards Fund. Right, now just work out what that means about pupil premium money and whether schools have got 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 pound extra to spend on pupil premium. What it means is that we're ring fencing money that's part of our core budget, and our budgets have been cut by £770,000 in real terms over that period. So that's the context that we're working in. And secondly, when you read Becky's article, it's all about the bell curve, isn't it? You know, it's all about actually if we're going to close the gap, if you're obsessed with closing the gap, what it's going to mean is actually bringing down the attainment of the top end to close that gap, right? So let's just shift the bell curve further across the graph. That's what we've got to do. So the one thing that we did years ago, back in 2010, we threw the kitchen sink at improving standards and improving attainment, and attainment just got worse. There's one of my blogs where I talk about sitting in the car on the day before, on the day I get the results, and the rain coming down on the bonnet of the car, and me weeping, genuinely weeping, after all that bloody effort, and the results just got worse. My wife said, "Just come home, John, you can give it up, don't worry." Instead, I resolved to do less and do better, and went back to actually trying to work out what works. And it coincided with the publication of the toolkit. And I have this chap at school called Alex Quigley, who is now our Director of Research, who just asks hard questions day in, day out. I'm not allowed to do anything anymore because my Director of Research says there's no evidence for it. Right? So I'll say, "Alex, what's the evidence say about highlighter pens?" Waste of time. And it's just like that all the time, but it's great. And so, we've got, on my blog, there's several examples of where we've actually gone to the research, thought about what we want to do, checked it out, and then had best bet decisions about implementation. Now, if there's one message I'd have, it's about the implementation. Right? It's about about evaluation, because begin with what you want to evaluate and what you want to get hold of and what you want to achieve, and then how you're going to evaluate it as you go along. And I think process evaluation, something I've learnt about in the last 2 years working with the EF and Rob Cohen people, process evaluation is really interesting, because you can say you've done something. We've sorted out feedback, but I've got 112 teachers. How do I know how 112 teachers have implemented our new feedback policy? Right. So it's about process evaluation, evaluating the process of implementation, and the outcomes are less of an important check, because if you don't know how an intervention is implemented, you can't evaluate it properly, right? Because every time you implement an intervention, it's going to be implemented by different people in different ways. And if you're doing that across the system, that's going to be really, really hard. I think, for me, evaluation is really important. Highly structured interventions work best. I do things about the head teacher and the climate of the school. And one of the things, if I come back to the money, if you read, and it's at the bottom of page 8, it is really shocking that 1% of schools say they're using peer-to-peer tutoring, and 4% are citing improving feedback, because they're really cheap. They don't cost you anything to do well. And they're the most effective. It's 8 months and 6 months of learning gain. So there are really, really inexpensive things that you can do. And ultimately, as everybody who's sat in this chair has said this morning, improve the quality of teaching for everybody. That's what you've got to do. So all your systems have to be coherent. Your CPD has to be coherent. As Michael Wilshaw said, CPD every day, every week, every month. It's not just 5 days a year. So all those things together, I could go on and on and on.
Thanks. Paul Crisp again from the Centre for the Use of Research and Evidence in Education. That was really interesting. I'm disappointed this session is right at the end of the day. I think it might have been nice had it been about 3/4 of the day. But it's great to hear such a body of expertise looking at us from the other end of the room there. I just want to make 2 or 3 quick points. Firstly, I'd say we have seen a movement in the profession over the last 10 or 15 years towards a more evidence-informed set of practices. So I think Tim's concern about, is it happening, is this actually impacting at school and classroom level? I think there is a growing body of evidence that it is. I see this every day when we meet groups of teachers. We work in schools where we see people actually using evidence to inform their practices. So I think there's definitely moving in the right direction. I think there is an interesting challenge though, which is that we tend to interpret autonomy in schools as meaning everybody's entitled to do exactly what they like, and that clearly there's quite a lot of evidence that some things don't work. So a naive discovery at the classroom level is probably a bad idea, and that means that at the school level there is some degree of imposition of the kinds of thing that John's talking about, which is, here's a protocol, we know it works, please follow this. We see this in terms of the research that EEF and others commission. We also see some weaknesses in the results because those protocols are not being followed, because teachers will do what teachers do. So I'm interested to know how we can kind of bring those two things together. How can we maintain the kind of right degree of professional discretion at the teacher level, and at the same time, frankly, stop people wasting their time and the public money and children's life chances by doing what they fancy doing and not doing the thing that we know works?
I think it's a good question, because it sort of came up in that first session as well, as I felt there's inspirational head teachers doing, stuff which was almost cultural. It was like, they knew what they were doing. And I was just thinking, as someone who's proposed research, how do those two things map onto each other? I think you need both, actually. You need professional autonomy and research. But anyway, John, do you want to start? We'll go this way around. So, John.
Yeah, okay. I'd say that in my experience, teachers are delighted when you've got some way of showing them what the research says and what the best bets are, right? They don't want to be flailing around guessing, right? Because there's too much of a waste of time, of their time and their effort. And I think when you create a culture where you have, you base a lot of what you do on the research, they're quite delighted about that step into professionalism. And I think you'll find that. I think you'll find there are far fewer teachers who want this massive autonomy to do what I want. I know what I can shut my door. I know what works. I don't think there are so many people like that. And when you make for us the professional obligation to improve your practice as part of the performance management system, There's a professional obligation you cannot get away from. And then you provide really good systems for them to be engaged with the research. And then the training that you have is weekly, fortnightly. We have much less contact time. We have some less contact time. We have training every fortnight plus your 5 days. And sometimes I take 7 days or 8 days and more sometimes. And only 1 or 2 parents realise. And then you've got a culture where improvement is the norm, is the cultural norm, perpetual improvement of your teaching.
Do you want to go next?
Sure. I think we have to have this balance between, on the one hand, saying children are unique, and I think, as Tim said, every pupil premium child has unique reasons why they might struggle to engage and learn at school. And on the other hand, kind of recognising that there are many, many common themes that are universally true. And I completely disagree that the last thing we want is naive discovery at the classroom level or even at the school level. There are not 21,000 different ways to lead a school effectively, and there are not 500,000 different ways to implement classroom practice effectively. What we do about this? Well, the thing that we've found when we go around, particularly talking to head teachers, is that what they don't do enough is know in their own heads where the schools that operate in the same types of circumstances as them are. They can't reel off that list. The lists exist. They exist on the DFE performance table site of similar schools. They exist on the EEF Families of School Toolkit. But they haven't accessed those, and they don't recognise that those are the places that they should be going to find best practice. So, for example, we've been going around talking to schools about how they integrate and the costs of integrating children who make arrivals at non-standard times into their schools, particularly those who are entering the UK education system for the first time or who have otherwise been excluded at other schools. And there's some fantastic practice around this, and there's a complete vacuum in other schools, even where there's very high levels of pupil mobility, about what they should be doing. And there's very obvious solutions that they should be going and looking up that list of similar schools and similar schools close to them, and they should be picking up the phone and going and visiting them.
Okay, Tim?
I have nothing further to add. We've had 2 good answers, and I'm sure there'll be lots more questions in due course.
One perhaps additional thing. One of the advantages of being an academic is people put up with you being mildly pedantic at times. And one of the areas where I'm really insistent is around the difference between what works and what's worked. And the toolkit is what's worked, past tense, in other contexts. And there are all sorts of reasons for that I could really bore the audience with. But one of the core ones is that if you present it as what's worked, you're giving professional responsibility to the people who make the decision to make a decision and do their best to ensure that it then does work for them. And I think that's essential, because autonomy has to be balanced with professional responsibility. And of course teachers want the best for their kids. What we've got to do is provide the evidence and information that will let them choose solutions that they can commit to, and that in itself will make a difference, just as Tim was saying before. It's not medicine where we're coming up with new antibiotics. We're looking at human interaction where commitment and authenticity is essential.
So Tim, just to press on that, because Sir Michael was saying that, but it seemed to me anyway, that you just get good leaders, right? That seemed to be. What would be your response to that then?
It's always good to put a civil servant on the spot like that. Clearly, everything that Sir Michael has said is absolutely right. Clearly, a good leader can make a really big difference. We all know there are leaders who've turned around their schools. You had the head teacher of Charter School in Portsmouth, who may still be in the room. Are you here? No. Okay, who I think has turned around that school.
Sure.
I look back at St Michael's Roman Catholic Primary School, my own primary school, which was in special measures, a really outstanding head who commuted from Milton Keynes to Chatham every day for 5 terms till he changed that school around. And as his deputy said to me, in all honesty, we're in the top 1% of value added from Key Stage 1 to Key Stage 2. It shows you how badly we let down the children in infant school. That degree of rigorous honesty in a leader is very powerful. But we also know that no leader exists in a vacuum and no teacher exists in a vacuum. If we went to Charter Academy in Portsmouth or St Michael's, most of the staff are the same staff who were there before. But their teaching is now way better. And it's way better in part because of leadership, but in part because leadership has empowered good teaching to be effective. You can't teach well in a school if discipline is lax. There are some things that senior management takes responsibility for and then creates the conditions for a teacher to be brilliant, or at least for a teacher to be as good as they can. But equally, we know that with good CPD, even with weak management, teachers can improve, even if they don't reach their sort of full blossoming potential because the school is not well run. So leadership is very important. There are virtually no outstanding schools with bad leadership, or certainly they don't remain outstanding in a deep sense of the word, rather than as an Ofsted category. Sorry, that wasn't supposed to sound as adversarial as it may have done. But we know that without good leadership, schools are going to tail off. There are decisions to, and all of us in our different organisations will know that leadership is important, but it certainly isn't the only thing.
Okay, thank you. Because it struck me with Claire, one of the head teachers in the earlier panel, she said, look, I look at the evidence, but then I see if it works for my school. And as a leader, but anyway, it's that interaction that's important.
David Crossley, Hull Ed. I wanted to pick up on one of the themes about the long-termism of what we're doing, because Russell picked it up this morning that we I think we're probably, without the evidence to prove it, world leading at short-term interventions, and we've certainly got very, very good at it. There's no way people will ignore those, but I'm wondering, is there any thoughts of how we can harmonise the short and the longer term and help people have tools to demonstrate the interim impact of longer term endeavours? Because I think often people give up on the longer term because they feel they can't identify and show the progress, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Fiona Spellman from Shine. I just wanted to pick up on some of the things that Tim was saying, kind of extending the medical analogy somewhat. So you talked about using sort of more diagnosis along the lines of what the medical profession does, and also how research is obviously used much more in medicine than it is in education currently. But I wondered if that could be extended to think about treatment in the way that doctors, you don't have a GP that's expected to treat, a child right through to elderly and all the complex needs that those might have, whereas a teacher has to meet the needs of every child in their class, irrespective of where their background is. And it kind of also wanted to touch on something that Becky had said about the CD borderline kids being the priority. I used to be a maths teacher, and we'd give the...
Please come back.
There's a lot of us in this room, I think.
That's the big problem.
But we used to have, you give your best staff to the CD borderline, you give your next best staff to the Bs and As, and you give your least experienced, least effective staff to those at the bottom end of the ability spectrum, in which group the most disadvantaged children are overrepresented. And so I wondered whether there's a greater role for specialist treatment, as it were, as a kind of analogy in teaching.
Thanks, Josh Hillman from the Nuffer Foundation. I mean, it's obviously a big watershed that we now have a situation where you have 2/3 of schools using an accessible form of evidence. But I would slightly question the quality and security of the evidence that underpins that. It's obviously as good as it is, and you guys have done a massive national service by bringing it all together in that form. You combine that with the sort of quite devastating points that Becky's been making about the ways that we've been measuring outcomes as well. And I have a slightly less rosy picture of the extent to which we can move forward with the existing evidence base. So my kind of nerdy question, really, for the researchers and sort of research managers on the panel is, what data would help us to improve that, and actually more to the point, what access to data would help us to move that forward in the next sort of 3 to 5 years, that could allow the sort of toolkit of the future to be a more secure basis for advising schools about how best to use their pupil premium, because I think we're still quite a long way from that.
Okay, thank you. Should we start with those? So long-termism first, I think. I won't group these are 3 separate questions. So does anyone want to? I think it's a very good question. Tim, do you want to go first, and then John? Yeah.
So long-term is obviously really important. If you're a primary school and kids get a slightly better Key Stage 2 result and then they just fall over in Year 7, you may not really have achieved anything. If they go on to get the same old GCSEs they would have got without your interventions, we do have to question whether that short-run intervention has been effective. And we do know that a lot of these interventions do seem to have half-lives. And that's because ultimately the role of the child themselves, their own inclination, their own ability to work hard, their own ability to resist the sweets put in front of you, the marshmallow test, their parental influences are always going to be more powerful than a 10-hour intervention in year 4. So there is going to be some, and again, the other way around, we know kids who've had a bad teacher of a year can pull back up. So yeah, there is always going to be some reversion to the mean. Nobody should think that one intervention can turn around a child's life. In terms of understanding the really long-run effects, this is where long-term data linking is very important. And Matthew Hancock, in the Small Business, Enterprise and Entrepreneurship Bill, which passed on the last day of the last Parliament, gave us the legal right to link the National Pupil Database with P60 and P45 tax data. And that will allow us to work out whether different qualifications are effective, whether different strategies are effective, provided we know who has had them. So for all of those of you who are running programs, I urge you, keep a list of the children. If you've been running programs for people who are now 25 or 30, even better. Send me that list, subject to your rules on data confidentiality that you have signed. Because then we can do really interesting things. So yesterday, or a couple of days ago, I was at the... Edward Timpson was talking about character in a joint event with the Scouts. Now, if the Scouts actually had information on who'd been a Scout, and critically, who had applied to join the Scouts and were not able to because of the waiting list, that would be a perfect test. Because then we would be able to take into account whether it's the fact that you want to join the Scouts and you naturally have the attributes that make you cooperative, that then means you do well in life, or whether the Scouts are actually inculcating a set of skills that are valuable later on. I very much doubt that for people who are now aged 25 to 30, the Scouts have records of that calibre. But particularly for those who are spending Nuffield money or our money or your money, if you keep those records, then one day we will be able to tell you what worked. It will still be retrospective. But even then, if it worked and the amount by which it worked seems to be going up over time, we can be more confident, whereas if it's going down over time, we can say, well, that worked for children in the 1980s, but maybe it's not relevant now. So I think that to be honest, I think we should be erecting a statue to Matthew Hancock by public subscription, as they did in the Victorian era. I'm told that David Miliband created the National Pupil Database. I don't know if someone...
I think that might be right. Yeah.
And if so, then there should be a statue to him as well by public subscription, and they could be standing arms aloft like this together, standing up for evidence-based... I mean, the fact that none of us even know which politician created the National Pupil Database, in this room of all places, none of us know. Isn't that a tragedy?
We'll find out and put it in our report.
You should do, because it would be a wonderful world if a politician who does something like that is the one whose name we know and whose policies we celebrate. Because that sort of thing, to be honest, does far more than almost anything else a politician can do.
So, Becky, just want to come quickly and then I'll go to John.
And so to follow on another data request, we know a huge amount about variation in quality and in effectiveness across schools, and we know so much less about variation within schools, and we know that there is a huge amount of variation in the quality of teaching within schools. So it is very controversial, but my top pick would be pupil-teacher linked data.
Right.
Looking
John.
at the unions here.
Sorry, John.
Let me talk about this from a head teacher's point of view, because I think it's quite different. Because I think I've been quite lucky over my 8 years as head teacher of Huntington School. Because the data, and this is indicative of what it's like to be a head. The year I arrived, so in the August before I arrived in September, the headline figure was 59%. At the end of my first year, it was 60%. Then it went down to 57. Then it went down to 55. And at that point, that's when you have squeaky bum time. And if you don't have a governing body who supports you, you're out actually. And if you were inspected in that year, you'd be out too, but luckily I wasn't, and I knew what I needed to do, and we were at the bottom of a sigmoid curve, and then we went 63, 65, 75, 72, and the best value added we've ever had this last year. We're in the top 14% of schools nationally, and I held my nerve, my governing body held my nerve, and we had an inspection pattern that worked just right for us. I could have had a different inspection pattern and a different governing body, and things could have been very, very different for me and for the school. And we wouldn't be where we are now, recruiting brilliant teachers who want to come here, and we've got the luxury now of being able to actually work really hard on what matters and what counts, which is improving the quality of teaching in an environment where if Ofsted turn up tomorrow with no notice, or they turn up in the car park at 8:30, I would say to them, We can go wherever you want in the school. Just tell me where you want to go and I'll take you around and we'll have a good look, because I know the test of a good school is what's going on when no one's looking, and I'll take you around and they won't know we're coming, and it will be great, because I know it will be. But that could have been very different. That could have been eight years of developing that school, could have been 2. But when I set out in 2007, I set out a 10-year vision for the school, and you go around our school and you can see Vision 2018. And I said in September 2007 that I'm going to be here for 10 years. I'm 43, I'll be here till I'm 53. It'll be the core part of my working life to transform the school into the school that we want to create. And we have a vision on our wall everywhere around the school. That's quite rare in education, right? And if we could get to the point where you had an evidence-based profession where policy and development was based on what works, and then head teachers were supported in making that happen over time. That's the only way you do it, over time. So the cultural norms become what we do. It's a Huntington way of doing things, and it's great. And the quality of teaching's fabulous. Then you can work, but it takes a bit of trust and a bit of luck, and it shouldn't be down to luck and patterns of inspection processes.
Right, thank you. It reminds me of Russell's point earlier as well about, it's interesting that a lot of the research or evidence that's being done tends to be short-term in its nature rather than the longer-term, developing effective feedback in classroom, which takes time again. So I do think that's part of this same issue about long-term versus short-term. Good. Steve, do you want to just say something and actually maybe talk a bit about the third question as well?
Yeah.
Which is about the quality of evidence. Do you want to
Yeah, because my answer to those are quite closely related. I mean, in terms of the first about long-term, what we're doing with the EEF at this point is putting all of the data from all of the interventions into a single database, which hopefully will be able to link up with the NPD. So we will be able to track the impact of interventions over time, but also the impact of cumulative interventions. So that starts to address one of Josh's points, which is about kind of the long-term impact, because we don't know much about the long-term impact of interventions, and it's absolutely essential that we do that. The next one is far more difficult. Are we measuring the right things, and have we got the right data to understand, if you like, educational quality as opposed to tested attainment success? And that's a much harder question to answer. I think with the linkages that Tim was talking about, we will start to understand a bit more about impact on career, and that can be followed through, but there you're looking at a 25 to 30 year timescale, so we're not going to get the answers that you want quickly. In terms of the actual quality of the evidence within the toolkit at the moment, I guess I'm probably a glass half full person, and you must be a glass half empty, Josh, because I think we'd agree.
But that's good, because he's got the money and he still thinks that the thing's empty. So.
I think we'd agree that it's not good enough, but my argument is it's the best we've got, so it's our best starting point. And by feeding in information from EEF trials, by linking it to the NPD, by thinking about outcomes beyond schooling, we can start to create the quality of data that we need. But as I said before, we're not there yet.
I think, Josh, your point as well, I think a lot of people talk about evidence in the sector now, and I know that when the EEF team go out, when you actually get into detailed conversations about what you mean by evidence as well is an issue. So I think we would have quite a high standard of what we think of as evidence from the toolkit and from the EEF evaluations, but actually what is understood by evidence out there is, I think, is another issue. Anyway, just quickly on the medical analogy, Tim, do you want us to respond on that, about having specialist sort of teachers?
No, I don't, because I'm not a head. I mean, it sounds plausible to me, and we can all agree that someone who can train a PhD person...
John, on the specialist teachers... So this is the idea of having particular treatments. It's a sort of
specialising in teaching some sorts of kids.
I just think there are some pretty sound principles about teaching. I mean, it's hard, isn't it? I mean, I took a group about 4 years ago of some disengaged Year 10 lads, and there are 13 or 14 of them. It's one of my most celebrated blog posts. I was offered a second year, I'm going to be... shoot me down. I was offered second year in teaching Nicole to help me. I said, no, this is about boys with boys. I don't need any help. No one needs to really listen to what was going to go on in those rooms, but those students over 18 months got nearly 70% A to C, which is way above what they should have got. But I could do that in a certain way.
you know, and I know lots about WWF wrestling, about football, about the importance of cake and food, and I know what 13, 14-year-old, 15-year-old lads can be like if they haven't got a stomach that's completely full all the time, because I've got two myself, right? So that gave me the expertise, right, to teach those. But it's about those things, and so I don't know if you can train that.
I do think the medicine sort of teaching analogy, you know, there's some things that work and some things where it breaks down a bit. I think, you know, we don't assume that everything that works in medicine works for teaching, but I think it's good to compare the two. Do you know what I mean? It's
tricky.
Can I come in just very quickly on
quickly.
that? The one thing I picked up from that is triage, because we see in medicine triage is done for very good reasons that have been tested and kind of work out why that's essential. In education, the triage that we get is as a result of the accountability system. So you get the CD borderlines getting the best because they can make the most difference to the results. That's not equitable. That's a consequence of the accountability system. So we have to think really carefully about what drives that triage and how we allocate our best teachers. They should be going to our most vulnerable. So how we design a system where that would be effective, I think, is absolutely essential. The other point I'd like to make is about kind of diagnosis. I think what a lot of schools are good at, and what we heard about particularly this morning, is identifying the necessary conditions like attendance, like behaviour, getting those in place. But what schools often then miss, from my point of view, is the sufficient conditions that ensure effective learning. But getting attendance and getting good behaviour isn't enough. And what was missing, I thought, from the inspiring accounts that we heard this morning is they just assumed that high-quality teaching and learning was there. And it was in those cases. But if you look at that school, you can make a mistake and think that it's about attendance and all of the things they did to create the necessary conditions. You also need to ensure that learning takes place subsequently. And that's where, again, the medical analogy falls down for me.
Listen, let me just thank again the panel. It was a brilliant panel. Thanks for all the questions. Thank you very much.